who got into journalism. Well, let me just start from his beginning. He was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1941. At the age of 12, his family moved up to Hartford, Connecticut. And so he was born in Jim Crow South, and then he grew up and moved into Integrated North, and then also went to University of Hartford in Connecticut, University of Connecticut, not Hartford, but in Storrs, but he grew up in Hartford. But also that's also where he saw Malcolm speak in 1963.
Yep.
After he graduated, he went into the Army, served in Vietnam, and he served under General Westmoreland. And a little bit about that is it was where while he was serving that, he really learned about the power of journalism. He was a speechwriter for General Westmoreland, ran his Army newspaper for the base, and he had an opportunity to take a journalist who was writing a story from for the Washington Post, Jesse Lewis, and he was writing stories about what was life like for the troops in Vietnam. And he wrote a story about the Confederate flags being flown on the base. And just that this is what was happening, not that there was any right or wrong about it, but that was happening. And President Johnson at the time, who read the story, was upset, calls up General Westmoreland 3:00 in the morning, Saigon time, chews out General Westmoreland, tell them they take those flags down. And Dad was excited because he saw the power of journalism, that the power of putting information out there in the people's minds to have them help make informed decisions. And this right, is being put out there by a free press, which is why we have to fight to protect our free press. And this right is protected by the United States Constitution.
Right.
So it's really important to do that. And Dad saw that, and when he worked in journalism, this is what he was working on, believing the power of journalism was. It's also the other intention for him in working in journalism, that by giving people information, particularly our people information, make informed decisions about how we live our lives, not to be spooked by the misleadings that were already being reported, particularly even about us.
Right.
And he also worked in journalism in 1975. He and some colleagues who were working at other Black men and women, 44 founders, and they just, of the National Association of Black Journalists in 1975, they just celebrated the 45th anniversary over the weekend of the founding of the National Association of Black Journalists, which was all about bringing
family on the
bringing Black journalists into the field and getting their training, also to improve the coverage of the Black community, wherever it is, whether it's north, south, east, or west, and also let them know about stories abroad and how it affects us. So, and giving people the opportunity to practice this, because what was happening is that Black people would get into the newsroom, but they weren't getting training.
Sure.
And, and that's how they do us. They say, oh, we'll hire you, and they'll say they do it under quotas or whatever, and then we don't work out because they're not giving us the training, and we're not necessarily seeking out, but they are training, our white counterparts. So, and then oftentimes, Dad would often tell the story of where are the Black interns when they have this summer intern program. He's like, there are no Black interns. Where are they? And the fellow editors saying, we can't find anybody who's, qualified. He says, yeah, but we have a room full of unqualified white reporters. So here's this whole thing of understanding that when we're judged when we get into these positions, we're not judged on our potential, what we could potentially do. We're only judged on what we've accomplished. And we have been doing it for 5-10 years, and we're usually the lowest paid and certainly less recognized than our counterparts in the newsroom. So again, the importance of organizing and having numbers and an organization to talk where you can share these stories and know that, one, you're not alone, and two, develop a way of understanding what you're up against and how to go up against it. And this is just really important. And this is what my father, really was doing with journalism. He also did this with the Trotter Group later on when he put that together, but also in the stories that he covered that were really important. I mean, he covered stories, you get assignments to do that, but he also covered stories that are important to us. For example, migrant workers who were working out in the East End of Long Island, A lot of stories were written about migrant camp workers around the country, but they're written from the perspective of the landowners, not from the actual migrant farmers. And part of the reason, again, as a journalist, how do you develop your sources if a person can't trust you? If you're white going into that camp, why would they talk to you?
Right.
Dad actually, disguised himself. He wasn't walking in there with his three-piece suit as a reporter, but he walked in and said, hey, I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and one of the guys in the camp knew the family from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and asked, where exactly in Tuscaloosa are you from? And would ask tested Dad actually on where things were located, and luckily Dad knew because it could have been problematic. But he wrote this story mainly so that we could really see what the lives and what they were bringing, what their experiences and why they, seem to be in this working as migrant, what their lifestyle was, because that wasn't their perspective, was not being portrayed and dispensed. So that's kind of a quick thing. And he also did the heroin trail soon after that. Heroin trail is really tracing heroin trail from the poppy, heroin, which was grown in poppy fields in Turkey, and through the French Connection and into the veins of young Americans. But Dad's interest was because it was Black people that were dying at higher numbers. But it became important when to the government, obviously, when white people were dying in large numbers. But we were dying in large numbers long before they found it important to do that story. But he also, for his work in that, he worked with a team of 2 others, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his work on that.
Beautiful.
So those are some. And then later on, even 1976, when he did the covering of the Soweto uprising. So these are all stories that are important to him. He covered Jamaica, he covered Haiti, he covered other countries in Uganda. He covered Kenya. He covered a lot of stuff. So he covered a gamut, and these were all stories that are important to all of us as Black people.
Right.
But as Americans, I mean, it was important to everybody. Just not because of the color of our skin, but these stories are important. If we don't know these perspectives, how do we know that what's out there? So he brought that closer to us.
Facts. And he talked about going to see Malcolm X speak, and he says he walked in a Negro, came out a Black man, which is probably one of the great beginnings that created the book. And feel free to elaborate on that if you don't mind. I thought it was compelling. Honestly, like
the book, or just that?
Oh no, that well, we're gonna spend a lot of time on the book, but that actually, him going to see Malcolm X speak and how it inspired a spirit in him, and he left. He said he walked in a Negro and came out a Black man. And feel free. Yeah.
And that was in June of 1963 in Hartford. And he went there with his Jewish roommate because they were both juniors in college at University of Connecticut. But both of them were from Hartford, and they were interested in Malcolm. Dad was interested in Malcolm already because he had seen the documentary of the hate produced in 1959. But he witnessed Malcolm obviously speaking on television, and he really was, he wanted to see it's like how we would want to go see somebody speak live. You want to hear what they're like in real life, and what they're really saying. What Dad would say is that he liked the analysis Malcolm provided, and that he wasn't about turning the other cheek. That appealed to my father, but he wanted to hear what Malcolm was talking about. And Malcolm was talking about, segregation. He was against integration, so he was fighting against that. And he was talking about that in that particular speech. But he also was talking about the condition of Black people in that community. And he was referring to in this story, he was referring to Black people as Blacks. And he would flip between calling Black people, Blacks, and Negroes. And people at that time had accepted the term Negro. And, including my dad. He said, "Look, I'm a Negro." And then when he heard Malcolm say Black, he was like, "Wait a minute, what's that?" Wait a minute. And Black was considered derogatory. Just as Africa, saying you're from Africa was considered derogatory at that time.
Right.
So this was this is part of everybody's education and evolving, you know, and understanding who we are as a people. So Malcolm was going on, you know, flipping between black and Negro, and he finally says, he says, "You're comfortable with me calling you Negro, but what is Negro? But black and Spanish. So what you're saying is that I can call you black in Spanish, but I can't call you black in English." And that was just a lightning bolt that struck my dad's psyche. And it, you know, this thing where we don't necessarily think about how we see ourselves as inferior or have accepted this or internalized this and how we express ourselves or see ourselves, that cut through all of that night. And that's why Dad says, you know, it made such sense. And it's simple. It was very simple.
Yeah.
And that's how he walked out a black man, you know, said, why can't I say black in English?
Right.
That is the language I speak.
Right. Absolutely. And this book was a 30-year process. And he said he was inspired by interviewing two of his brothers. And can you transition into how you came aboard too? Like how he interviewed the two brothers and the steps he took, and then you came on board, or were you on board from day one? Take your time.
Take my time. Mm-hmm. Dad met one of the brothers in Detroit, mm-hmm. and through a friend of his, childhood friend of his, Walter Evans, mm-hmm. Who was a surgeon and was treating one of them, I believe. And so Dad had met him and he was interested. Obviously, this is one of Malcolm's brothers. He said, "I want to interview, if that's okay." And he said, "Sure." Dad sat down with him for 8 hours. And he was just blown away by what he was learning that he had not known. Because up until that point, Dad felt that he had no intention of writing a biography or a book about Malcolm. Because as a journalist, he wants to write about what's new. And he felt that we already knew everything we needed to know about Malcolm with the speeches and the autobiography he thought was great. And the thing about journalism is, like, he wants to know what's new. And that's going to help us understand the world we live in better. And so what he learned from this brother was he learned that they have a childhood. They have a family life. There's a household. There was relationships with siblings, but also with their mother and their father. Mm-hmm. Their parents were Garveyites. To say that their parents are Garveyites is one thing, but then to understand that how their parents are Garveyites is another thing, you know, and getting those details of what that's like in the home and how that influences Malcolm into the man that we know. Mm-hmm. Malcolm has always been, you know, presented to us, I say, in a vacuum, fully formed, mm-hmm. you know, meaning he sprung out of nowhere, and you know, and angry. And nobody understands why. Even if, as Black people, we understand why, but everybody else is saying, "Oh, he's too aggressive, he's too angry." But anyway, Dad gets all this information. He's fascinated by it. He's processing this, and through his filters of his own life experience. Now, mind you, he's already traveled around the world. He's covered Soweto. He's grew up in, you know, Jim Crow South. So all of this stuff, you know, he's filtering all this information and realizing how important this story is. He comes back to New York. He speaks with Gil Noble, who I don't know if your audience knows about, but it was also a very important journalist here in New York who hosted a show on WABC TV called Like It Is, which really presented great footage and information about not just our history, but our current situation. And he had that going on for a long time. So they were colleagues and friends, and Dad talked about meeting this brother, and Gil says to my dad, "Which brother did you speak to?"
Uh-huh. Oh, no, so you know,
the brother you should speak to is
okay. Oh no, I was going to tell you, I'm gonna write down the question so we can go in chronological order. So when people watch the interview, but people chime in and want to ask questions, so we'll save a spot at the end of the. And I'm just going to flash it onto the screen. I forgot to tell you that before we start the show, and we'll go back to these questions. Okay, thank you, Tamara. Excuse me.
No problem. Yeah, so he said that my father should go back and speak to Wilfred, and Dad did. And Wilfred told him a more amazing story. More amazing in the sense that Wilfred's the oldest brother, also turned out to be Malcolm's best friend and confidant. And so he's 6 years older than Malcolm, and the brother that my father spoke to originally was Filbert, who was 2 years older. Mm-hmm. So he gets these two perspectives from these brothers about Malcolm as a child, as a baby, but also their parents. And like what I was trying to say before about the beginning about saying that the parents are Garveyites is one thing to say that, but it's another thing when you hear that it's Louise, you know, his mother, who's imbuing them with their sense of who they are as Black people, and telling them not to accept Negro and to embrace being Black. She's always telling them, "You're Black, you're Black. This Negro, I mean, you're Black, you know, and don't be ashamed of it." She was always connecting them with Africa, and their father was teaching them, you know, the strong, you know, work ethic. You know, getting up early, setting up the chores, keeping the house. I mean, that house was a tightly run ship in the earlier days when their father was around, and it was very organized. And also, he took Malcolm to meetings that he was organizing families in these different towns, like Omaha and Milwaukee and Lansing, where they were organizing Black families to build up their own communities and start their own businesses and thrive under, you know, following these Garvey. They would have their meetings with set up UNIA posts there and have go to meetings and talk about that and organize and set up businesses and support each other. And this is important that we understand that Malcolm is getting this sense of who he is as a Black man and Black, where he's talking about